Take 1327. Rosebud, Rosebud. The last words spoken by the character Charles Foster Kane in the movie Citizen Kane. Those who heard that last word spoken wondered what could it mean. And as they searched far and wide, were unable to come to a conclusion as to what that word meant. But you and I, the visiting audience, we knew only too well what that meant. It harkened back to that little boy in the innocence out in the plains who had grown up in greed and avarice to become the Charles Foster Kane. I wonder the last words that are spoken. Sometimes we get a humorous take on them. The daredevil who says, I think I can make this. Or perhaps it is the person who says, hey, I wonder what that switch does. Or maybe the fellow who says to his partner, says, hey, hand me a match. I want to see how much gas there is in the tank. We may get a chuckle out of last words such as that. But there are times when those last words that we hear from loved ones, when we say, I remember the last time with mom and dad, or maybe the last time you had with a friend or loved one, perhaps before the tragedy took them far too soon. We may have misgivings and trouble reconciling because the last words we spoke weren't what they hoped would be. Now, it may not be anger or harshness that was expressed, but it may lack the substance because we talked about the weather and the sports score of last night's game. I often have the occasion in my line of work, being a minister, of presiding over funerals and giving the eulogy, the last words, as it were, about that person before they are buried. Sometimes I have the unenviable task of trying to make sense of a tragedy of someone that's gone too soon. I meet with families who themselves will try to share a vision of what they once said and expressed about that person who has passed away. It may be that they bring in yellowed photographs. It may be that they try to produce a hazy-hued holograph, as it were, of that person. And as they weave that tapestry together, I often will insert a question or two to try to clarify points. But for the most part, I simply let them talk. Because it is to them that they will share this lasting legacy. Now, you may think that my fascination sometimes with this subject is unusual. But I remind people that one day we will all be simply a memory to someone else. One day we will pass from this life to the next, and all we will be is that memory. I'd like to share with you a memory of a man that I went to school with. He and I had spent nearly all of our years together growing up in school, from grade school up to the day of graduation. But after graduation, I never saw him again. And one day the word came out that Glenn had passed away and that his funeral was coming up. I wanted to go, even though it was many miles and many hours away. And as I drove on through the night to be there, in my own mind, I tried to recreate those memories of this man I went to school with as a boy. Not having the job of presiding over the funeral or giving the eulogy, I was able just simply to sit in the back and view what went on. And as people stood up to tell about the impact that Glenn had on their life, I was taken aback. I was stunned by what I'd heard. A man in his 90s told of how Glenn would come over time after time, without charging him, to work on his old jalopy of a truck to keep it running. And then there was the little widow who told that Glenn would come over and put up her Christmas lights every year on her house. And if that weren't enough, a family of 3 generations from Africa stood up and sang a hymn in tribute to Glenn, who out of his own pocket paid a considerable amount of money to bring them from that war-torn country as refugees to the United States. And they sang that hymn in their native African language. Glenn planted a garden to feed the hungry in his community. He planted a peace garden where people could come and meditate. And story after story came out of the things that Glenn had done for others. In my own mind, I wondered, having heard what Glenn had lived in his life, if when all is said and done about my life, when I have passed from here, what will my lasting legacy be? Will people think of me and say, oh, now there was a person who was generous in giving? And we all would like to think of that. But is it true? Did I live a life of giving, or was I stingy? Was I trying to be a peacemaker, or was I always causing strife amongst people? I wondered, and having listened to the life that Glenn had left, it caused me to think, what will I do with the rest of my life? And what is the legacy that I will leave? A question I ask myself constantly. And perhaps we should all ourselves ask that question as well. Fellow Toastmasters,